Last chapter, I bet you thought we'd never get here. I sometimes think that too, but I've done this enough. I knew we'd eventually get here, right? So we end with the idea of the entire division of the nervous system that's devoted to to sending information to the brain so we can achieve awareness. And that we refer to as the somatic nervous system, right? So we said it's anatomically divided into the peripheral and the central, as I say here. It is functionally divided into somatic and autonomic, okay? Somatic is that allows conscious perception of our world and also then controls the things we choose to do based generally on that perception, all right? And one of the classic illustrations of this is what we call the reflex arc, right? Where you do a knee jerk, right? You tap on the knee, so sensory sensation has to occur. I shouldn't say sensation has to occur. Sensory, right? Proprioceptors and stretch receptors have to become stimulated by this physical act of striking, and the action potential that begins in the peripheral nervous system is sent to the central nervous system, but it's a reflex, so it only really goes to the unconscious level, the spinal cord or the brainstem. And then the spinal cord and brainstem, actually, we connect to motor neurons, which then go and respond, right? So this reflex arc is so called because, as you can picture, and we'll look here in a second, you picture incoming through the dorsal part of the spinal cord and outgoing through the ventral, so it forms an arc. All right, so here we are looking at this idea here, and this could be anywhere in the body here, but again, because we want to think generally. And this is also, again, takes us back to the very beginning of in chapter 1, the very beginning of this course, where we said, look, homeostasis is maintained by having sensors, receptors that are stimulated by change, right? Because homeostasis implies unchanging or balanced, right? So they sense a change, they send it to a controller, an integrator, and that controller and integrator directs a response that then is done by some effector, which is always a type of muscle or a gland for the body, right? So here we are looking at this idea in this abbreviated cartoon, right? Here's anywhere on the skin. Here's these receptors, and let's say these are touch or tactile receptors here, or temperature receptors here, right? And something change occurs. Again, it could be touch, it could be temperature, it could be pressure, pain, itch, and an action potential starts. The action potential moves in through these, right, unipolar, right, neurons that we see their cell bodies are collectively there in that dorsal root ganglia, and then it moves on through this modified axon into the central nervous system, the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, it is connected, we don't require an interneuron, but often there are, connected to then a motor neuron here. And these are interneurons, and motor neurons are often multipolar, right, just to reinforce that. And we're in the gray matter, right, so it's mostly cell bodies and unmyelinated parts, and sends, right, an action potential starts here, and it is sent on to then a motor neuron, which takes the stimulus out to an effector, in this case any muscle in the body. So let's say you touch something hot and you wanted to withdraw it. So this would have to be a flexor of some sort, maybe like the biceps. All right, and that's again called a reflex arc because it clearly makes this arcing pathway. All right, so simplest response, sensory. Always gonna have a sensory if you're gonna have a response, and this is also called the afferent or afferent, right? To the spinal cord in this case is the central nervous system, and this is a processor, and many times again it involves this connector, an interneuron, and then out through the motor, right, which is going out through the ventral or anterior part. All right, it really isn't that simple, but we're going to keep it fairly simple just to remind you that you are a pretty complicated machine. The other sensory structures involved in modulating this response are just not even shown here, but you can already see there's a lot more connections than what we saw in the last slide. So while stimulating those flexors, and here we have a flexion occurring from the hamstrings as you stepped on something. This is called a withdrawal reflex, and it's the withdrawal reflex usually involves flexors. And so stepped on, here's our sensory here in the foot, right, that we're showing here. Here's your first point, is you made contact, and they're just separating the response from the sensor here. Okay, so you stepped on this, that immediately was carried into, you're aware of that. Now, awareness would be achieved if this actually ascended, and they're kind of showing this idea that it would ascend. So you could withdraw from things without being aware, because reflexes are, again, don't necessarily require awareness. But it's hard to separate the idea of awareness from the reflex. So let's just, again, understand that you've got the sensory coming in, and some of it results in an immediate withdrawal, and some of that information is ascending so that you are aware that you stepped on this thing that hurt, right, and that it did hurt. So we add, though, here, again, so here's our sensory coming in. We add that while you're stimulating the flexors, which are shown here, right, in the green, right, you have to also inhibit the extenders so that you don't go off balance, right? So the flexor is contracting, the extensor is not contracting, right? And by the way, on the contralateral leg, nothing. We don't want anything to happen, do we? All right, we want to keep in deflection and extension equal so that you stay still, right? So here again, they're looking at your inhibition here, going out to the extensors. Don't do anything. And here this one shows, here's a pathway, because it couldn't superimpose these pathways. That's what the problem, that's why they're separated here. Here's a pathway that goes out to, right, stimulate that flexor. And here's interneurons that are connecting, right, that are basically telling you not to, stay in this extended position, and on the opposite leg, don't flex at the same time, because you'll fall on your knees, right? So, yeah, so it's pretty complicated in the end. And then again, we add awareness and other senses that are going on, and you can see how very quickly this becomes a true network of understanding, and we want to stay simple. All right. So sensory perception. All right, because this is about the somatic sensory nervous system. So sensory helps us figure out what's going on, both inside our bodies and outside of our bodies. It's really and once we become aware and we start to become conscious of patterns, it really helps us a lot to stay alive. And again, or unconscious of patterns, it really kind of depends. But it always begins with some stimulus that happens because of a change. And this stimulus then changes the potential of a cell. So stimuli come in a lot of different categories, but we're going to keep it pretty simple. Mechanical stimulus, just the movement of something, right? Stretch, right? Or repositioning, like a proprioceptor. And pressure receptors are just, it's movement and that starts an action potential. Temperature, right? So the presence of heat can start an action potential, right? Chemicals are very good at this. Lots of chemistry changes, and that can start an action potential, all right? So a lot of different things fall into this idea of stimulus, and we are only as good as our ability to discriminate these different stimuli. All right, so just think about that for a little while. It's like if everything was taste or sight or touch, how we would be unable to respond to change. So it's important to have a variety. All right. Now, the action potential that's started by these sensors is sent to the central nervous system, as you saw on the previous slide, and oftentimes, again, the brain would be included. And when the brain's included, we talk about sensation, really. They often become integrated, right, because you're sending in lots of stimuli at once regarding the areas around or other changes caused by the event. So they have to be integrated. The brain has to, right, assemble all this, right? It has to sum what's happening here, right? And this is what we call perception. Again, this is where we're kind of qualifying what's happened here, right? I guess that's the best way to think of it. So receptors, right, that are our sensors, have these channels that open, ion channels, because that's how you start an action potential, and that's what we said, we have to change the potential of the cell. And this can happen also through ligands, mechanical or thermal, as I've already mentioned. So chemistry, mechanical, physical changes, or heat changes. right? Changes in heat. So here's some categories of these different receptors or sensors. Here's what we were looking at on the last slide, these free nerve endings that were coming in through an axon to a cell body, and this would be, of course, in the dorsal root ganglia, and then synapsing to another neuron within the gray matter of the spinal cord. All right, sometimes these are encapsulated, so this is an example of like your lamellated Pacinians, the Meissners, corpuscles. When we call it a corpuscle, it's generally encapsulated and still comes in through, again, this unipolar dorsal root ganglia. All right, and then we have some really specialized ones that we're going to look at in this chapter as well. And this one is one from the eyes that's called the rod. So, and this one responds to light, which is makes it a special sense. All right, so again, these receptors, as I've already mentioned, we have to look at them based on their structure and their function. I'm hoping you're used to this idea that we categorize a lot of ways. We did with the joints, right? We did this with types of neurons, so it shouldn't be a surprise that we have these categories, right? So we have free nerve endings structurally, right? Pain and temperature are the way we send these. So when you look at your skin models, you can pick those out. We have encapsulated ones, like I said, like the Pacinian or the Meissners. And then we have specialized receptor cells, like the photoreceptor. So here's our same three again. Functional receptors. So we have chemoreceptors. These are ones that are responding to chemical changes. And this is taste and smell. Osmoreceptors are basically responding to a difference in the amount of a molecule, right? So concentration of solutes. Nociceptors, which is pain, and a lot of them are chemical, but not exclusively chemical. Stretch receptors are what dominate inside the body that result in pain. So a lot of them are chemical, but not all of them, all right? Mechanoreceptors, pressure, vibration, sound, when we get to the special senses in hearing, balance, all these are part of the inner ear, but they are technically mechanoreceptors. These hair cells are just, they're bent and they start the action potential. So mechanoreceptors, it's a physical change. And then thermoreceptors, oops, misspelled temperature, I'm sorry. The A is next to the S on the keyboard, right? So thermoreceptors are really a physical stimulus as well, right? So change in the amount of heat in the system. All right. Where do you find these receptors? Well, they better be located so they can encounter, right, their stimuli, right? You don't want to put a photoreceptor deep inside the body where light doesn't penetrate, right? It's got to be in a place that light can get to it. And similar for sound and so forth. So location. So receptors are distributed throughout the body. We have three groups here, right? There's exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, and proprioceptors. So these are what you're seeing in the skin model, right? Touch, pressure, pain, temperature. And then intero, change in interior things. And these are, again, mechanoreceptors or chemoreceptors generally, the interoreceptors, but they would be within the body, right? Not on the surface. And then proprioceptors are changes in position. So think P for P. And these we find almost exclusively in the joints of the body. All right? So sensory modalities, what is it? You know, we talk about many senses, and the more the better, right? So you have many senses, and more of these the better, because I said this refines our ability to understand the world and detect change. Because deviation from change that cannot be restored is disease. So you need to begin with two groups, the general or the special senses. So general, again, are distributed throughout the body. Special senses have a specific organ, eye, inner ear, tongue, and nose. That's what makes them special. Right? A modality is really about what sensation is for this sense. So while we consider touch a sensation, its modalities, right? So the way, what do we sense, are light pressure, deep pressure, vibration, itch, pain, temperature, hair movement, for example. So lots of, again, of these classes or groups fall into a touch, what we're calling a modality. All right, we're going to stop there so that we can pick up and start talking exclusively about these examples on the next video.